No one heard the explosion clearly, because the desert swallowed the sound before it could travel, turning what should have been chaos into a hollow, unnatural silence that stretched across miles of burning sand and shattered metal. And in that silence, beneath the wreckage of a destroyed convoy half buried by a rising sandstorm, lay a man who had already been counted as dead, a man whose last transmission had cut off mid-sentence, whose coordinates had been marked with a cold red cross, whose team had been erased from the map, like they had never existed, except something about that moment didn't feel finished, not to the desert, not to the wind, and certainly not to the German shepherd standing alone on a distant ridge, its body rigid, ears cutting through the howling storm, eyes locked onto something invisible to everyone else, something buried beneath a weight of sand and silence, something still breathing, even if the world had already decided it shouldn't be. And the dog didn't move at first, didn't bark, didn't panic, it just stood there as if listening to a voice that didn't exist, a memory carried through wind, a heartbeat echoing beneath the ground, and then slowly, almost unwillingly, it took a single step forward, and that step would change everything, because in a war zone where orders define life and death, the dog had just made a decision that wasn't given to it, a decision no one commanded, a decision driven by something deeper than training, deeper than instinct, something that felt dangerously close to choice. And far behind that ridge, miles away from the wreckage, a retired soldier sat, inside a rusted-out outpost carved into stone, staring at nothing as the wind rattled loose metal against the walls, his eyes hollow in a way that only years of war could carve into a man, not just the kind of war fought with weapons, but the kind that stays long after the battlefield is gone, the kind that leaves voices in the silence, faces in the dark, and regrets that never quite fade. And he had promised himself he was done. Done with missions, done with orders, done with the endless cycle of survival and loss. But the desert had a way of pulling people back, especially the ones who thought they had already escaped it. And when the first distant bark cut through the wind, it didn't sound real, it sounded like something remembered, like a ghost echo from a life he had tried to bury. And he didn't move at first, didn't react, because in places like this, chasing sounds was how people disappeared. But then it came again, sharper this time, urgent, alive, and something inside him shifted, something old and buried rising to the surface whether he wanted it or not. And outside, the storm thickened, sand cutting through the air like invisible blades, visibility dropping to almost nothing, the kind of storm that erased tracks, erased direction, erased people. And yet through the chaos, the German shepherd kept moving, step by step, paws sinking into shifting ground, its body pushing forward with quiet determination, guided not by sight, but by something far more precise, something that pulled it closer with every second, until finally, the shape of destruction emerged through the storm, twisted metal, burned vehicles, fragments of what used to be a team. And the dog slowed, its breathing heavy now, eyes scanning, searching, listening, until it found him, half buried beneath debris, unmoving, barely visible. And for a moment, everything stopped again, the wind, the sound, even time itself seemed to pause as the dog stepped closer, lowering its head, pressing its nose against the man's face, waiting. And for a second, nothing happened, just silence. The same silence that had already claimed everything else. But then, so faint it could have been imagined, the man's chest moved, a shallow, broken breath fighting its way through dust and blood, and the dog froze again, not in fear, but in recognition, because this wasn't just survival anymore. This was something fragile, something hanging by a thread that could snap at any moment. And without hesitation, the dog turned, sprinting back into the storm, leaving the man behind, not to abandon him, but because, somewhere in the distance, it knew there was someone who needed to see this, someone who needed to believe that the dead weren't always gone. And inside the outpost, the retired soldier stood up slowly, the sound of barking now impossible to ignore, something in it too real, too urgent, and as he stepped outside into the storm, pulling his coat tight against the violent wind, he didn't know that the next few hours would drag him back into a world he had sworn to leave behind, a world of danger, decisions, and consequences that never came without cost. And far ahead of him, the German shepherd ran through the desert with a purpose no command could have created, because somewhere beneath the sand, a man was still breathing, and the world had no idea yet that it was wrong. The wind didn't just howl anymore. It screamed, tearing across the desert like something alive, pushing against the retired soldier with a force that felt almost personal, as if the land itself was trying to turn him back, trying to keep him from seeing what lay beyond the storm. But he kept moving, step after step into the chaos, guided only by the distant, desperate sound of barking that cut through everything else like a blade. Sharp, urgent, impossible to ignore, and with every step forward, something inside him tightened, something old waking up, something he had buried under years of silence and distance, the part of him that knew what that kind of bark meant, not fear, not panic, but purpose, and that made it worse, because purpose in a place like this usually meant one thing. Someone was still alive when they shouldn't have been, and somewhere ahead, barely visible through the wall of sand, the German shepherd stopped again, turning back just long enough to make sure he was following, its body tense, eyes locked onto him for a fraction of a second before it turned and disappeared once more into the storm, not waiting, not hesitating, because time wasn't something they had anymore, and the soldier felt it too, that invisible clock ticking somewhere beyond sound, beyond logic, a pressure that pushed him faster, deeper into a place he knew could kill him just as easily as it had taken the others. And as he moved forward, shapes began to emerge from the storm, first shadows, then outlines, then the unmistakable forms of destruction, burned-out vehicles twisted into unnatural angles, pieces of equipment scattered like broken bones across the sand. The aftermath of something violent and final, something that had ended lives in seconds, and for a moment, his steps slowed, not from fear, but from recognition, because he had seen this before too many times, the kind of scene where you already knew the ending before you even reached it, the kind where no one walked away, but the barking didn't stop. It got louder, sharper, pulling him forward despite everything he knew, and when he finally reached the center of the wreckage, he saw the dog first, standing over a shape in the sand, its body low, protective, eyes locked on him as if warning him to come closer, but not too fast, not too careless. And then he saw the man, barely visible beneath layers of dust and debris, his body twisted at an angle that should have meant death, his uniform torn, blood dried into the fabric, and for a second, the soldier didn't move, didn't speak, because there was a part of him that refused to believe what he was seeing, a part that had learned the hard way that hope in places like this came with a price. But then the dog stepped aside just enough for him to kneel, just enough for him to see the faint rise and fall of the man's chest, so shallow it almost didn't exist, and everything inside him shifted in that moment, the doubt, the hesitation, the distance he had built over years collapsing under the weight of a single truth. This man was still alive, and that changed everything, because now it wasn't about staying out of it anymore. It wasn't about walking away or pretending the war was over for him. Now it was about a choice, the same kind of choice the dog had already made without hesitation, without permission, and as he reached out, pressing his fingers against the man's neck, searching for a pulse that felt more like a memory than a signal of life, he found it, weak, uneven, but there, and the realization hit him harder than any explosion ever could, because this wasn't just survival, this was something fragile, something that shouldn't have lasted this long, something that was running out, and the dog let out a low sound, not a bark this time, but something deeper, something that felt almost like urgency mixed with trust, as if it knew that this man in front of it was the only chance left, and the soldier understood that without words, because he had been in this position before, not exactly like this, but close enough to know what came next: the race against time, the decisions that couldn't be undone, the weight of responsibility that settled onto his shoulders the moment he chose not to walk away. And around them, the storm continued to rage, sand shifting, burying parts of the wreckage deeper with every passing minute, erasing signs, erasing paths, turning the entire area into something that would disappear completely if they didn't move. And that was the real danger now, not just the injuries, not just the distance, but the desert itself, slowly closing in, swallowing everything it touched. And he could feel it, the way the ground shifted beneath his knees, the way visibility dropped even further, the way the air itself seemed to thicken, making every breath heavier than the last. And he knew they couldn't stay here, not even for a few more minutes. But moving the man wasn't simple. Not with injuries like that. Not with conditions like these. One wrong movement could end it. One mistake could turn that faint pulse into nothing. And yet doing nothing would lead to the same result, just slower, just quieter. And for a brief moment, doubt crept in, that same old voice whispering that this wasn't his fight anymore, that he had already done enough, already lost enough. But then the dog stepped closer again, pressing its head lightly against his arm. Not forcefully, not aggressively, just enough to remind him that this wasn't about the past, this was happening now. And that single touch carried more weight than any command ever could, because it wasn't asking, it wasn't begging, it was trusting. And trust like that wasn't something you ignored. Not if you were still human, not if there was anything left inside you that remembered what it meant to fight for someone else. And as he looked down at the man again, at the fragile rise of his chest, at the life that refused to let go despite everything stacked against it, he made the decision. The same kind of decision that had pulled him into this world in the first place. The same kind that always came with consequences. And as he adjusted his grip, preparing to move the man out of the wreckage, the dog stepped back into position, watching the horizon, alert, ready, because deep down, it knew something else was coming, something beyond the storm, something that hadn't revealed itself yet. And the desert, silent as ever beneath the chaos, seemed to agree. The moment he lifted the man, everything changed, not just the weight in his arms, but the entire atmosphere around them, as if the desert itself had noticed, as if something unseen had shifted its attention toward them. And the soldier felt it immediately, that quiet tension that crawled up the spine without sound, without warning, the kind that didn't come from the storm or the wreckage, but from something far more deliberate. And he didn't stop, didn't hesitate, because stopping now meant choosing death over movement. And he had already made his decision. The man's body was lighter than it should have been, not because he wasn't injured, but because there was barely anything left holding him together. Every breath shallow, every movement fragile, like carrying something that could disappear at any second. And the dog moved ahead of him, cutting through the storm with a precision that felt unnatural, not random, not desperate, but calculated, like it knew exactly where it needed to go, even when the world around them had been reduced to swirling sand and shifting shadows. And behind them, the wreckage slowly vanished into the storm, swallowed piece by piece, until it was as if it had never been there at all. And for a brief moment, the soldier glanced back, not out of fear, but out of instinct. And that's when he saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough to know it was real, movement where there shouldn't have been any. Shapes breaking through the storm in the distance. Too controlled to be debris, too deliberate to be chance, and his grip tightened instantly, every sense sharpening as the old instincts took over completely, because this wasn't just a rescue anymore, this was something else, something that meant they weren't alone. And the realization hit hard, because whoever had caused the destruction back there wasn't finished, not if there was still something left to find. And suddenly, the barking made sense in a different way, not just a signal of life, but a risk. A beacon in a place where silence meant survival, and the dog seemed to understand that too. Because its movements changed, faster now, more cautious, weaving through the terrain instead of moving straight across it, using the land as cover, choosing paths that dipped into shadows and rose behind broken ridges, and the soldier followed without question, because at this point, the dog wasn't just guiding him, it was leading him, making decisions that could mean the difference between reaching safety or being found. And the wind picked up again, stronger than before, sand hitting his face like needles, visibility dropping even further until everything became shapes and guesses. And yet through all of it, the dog never slowed, never hesitated, its focus locked onto something beyond the storm, something only it seemed to understand. And the man in his arms shifted slightly, a weak sound escaping his lips, barely more than a breath, but enough to confirm that he was still there, still holding on. And that added another layer of urgency, because now it wasn't just about distance or danger, it was about time, time that was running out faster than the storm could move. And as they pushed forward, the terrain began to change, the flat, open sand giving way to uneven ground, scattered rock formations rising out of the desert like broken teeth, offering brief moments of cover, brief chances to breathe, and the soldier used them instinctively, moving from one shadow to the next, pausing only long enough to adjust his hold or check the man's breathing, and every time he stopped, the dog would turn back, watching him, not impatient, but aware, as if measuring how much time they had left, and then it would move again, always forward, always towards something unseen, and the shapes behind them grew clearer, not in detail, but in certainty. They were being followed, not closely, not yet, but enough to confirm what he already feared, and that changed everything again, because now the desert wasn't just a hostile environment, it was a battlefield, one where he was outnumbered, outgunned, and carrying a man who couldn't defend himself, and the only advantage he had was the dog. And that realization hit differently, because in all his years, in all the missions and operations and losses, he had never depended on something like this, not without communication, without orders, without structure, just trust, pure and absolute, and somehow, it felt more reliable than anything he had known before. And as they moved deeper into the shifting landscape, the storm began to break slightly, not enough to clear the air, but enough to reveal outlines of something ahead, a narrow passage between rock formations, almost hidden unless you were looking for it, and the dog headed straight for it without hesitation, slipping into the shadows as if it had been there before, as if it knew exactly what waited on the other side, and the soldier followed, stepping into the darkness just as the wind howled louder behind them, carrying with it the faint sound of something else, something mechanical, distant but unmistakable, and for a brief moment, his heart dropped, because that sound didn't belong to the storm, it belonged to people, to machines, to something coming closer with purpose. And as the darkness of the passage closed around them, cutting off the worst of the wind but amplifying every other sound, every breath, every step, every movement, the tension tightened into something almost unbearable, because now there was no doubt left. They weren't just running from the desert anymore. They were running from something that had already started hunting them. The moment they stepped fully into the narrow passage, the world changed again, the violent roar of the storm fading into a distant echo, while the darkness wrapped around them like something alive, thick and heavy, swallowing light, swallowing distance, turning every sound into something closer than it should be. And the soldier slowed instinctively, not because he wanted to, but because moving fast in a place like this was how you lost everything in seconds. And the man in his arms let out another weak breath, his body shifting slightly, reminding him that stopping wasn't an option either, that every second spent hesitating was a second taken away from whatever chance they still had left. And ahead of him, the German shepherd moved with a kind of precision that didn't belong to panic or fear, its body low, steps careful, ears constantly shifting, listening to things he couldn't hear yet. And that was the only thing keeping him grounded, the fact that the dog wasn't reacting blindly, it was calculating, choosing every movement like it had already mapped this place out in its mind. and as they pushed deeper into the passage, the air grew cooler, the smell of dust mixing with something else, something metallic, something old, and the walls closed in tighter around them, forcing him to adjust his hold on the man, to angle his body just to keep moving forward, and every small movement felt louder than it should have. The scrape of fabric against rock, the uneven rhythm of breathing, the faint shift of sand underfoot, all of it echoing in a way that made it feel like they weren't alone, like something else was moving with them just out of sight. And then the dog stopped again, completely still, its body freezing in place in a way that made the soldier's entire system lock up instantly, because that wasn't hesitation, that was warning, and he lowered himself slightly, tightening his grip on the man while scanning the darkness ahead, but there was nothing visible, just shadows layered on top of shadows, the kind that played tricks on the mind. And for a second, he thought maybe it was nothing, maybe it was just the dog reacting to the unfamiliar space. But then he heard it, faint, distant, but real, the sound of something shifting against rock, something controlled, not random, not natural, and his chest tightened immediately, because that sound didn't belong to the storm, it belonged to people, and the realization hit harder now, clearer than before. They weren't just being followed from a distance. Something had already moved ahead of them, something had anticipated their path, and the dog didn't bark, didn't make a sound. It simply turned its head slightly, eyes locking onto him for a brief second, and in that look, there was something unmistakable, not fear, not confusion, but understanding, and without a word, without hesitation, it shifted direction, moving off the main path and into a narrower split in the rock that was almost invisible unless you were right on top of it, and the soldier followed instantly, trusting that decision without question, because at this point, the dog wasn't just guiding him, it was reading the situation faster than he could, reacting to threats he hadn't fully processed yet, and the passage grew tighter, darker, forcing them into slower, more controlled movement, the kind that tested every muscle, every nerve, and behind them, the faint sounds grew slightly clearer, still distant, but enough to confirm that they were being tracked, methodically, patiently, like something that knew exactly what it was doing. And the soldier's mind began to race, not with panic, but with calculation, mapping out possibilities, escape routes, risks, the weight of the man in his arms reminding him constantly that this wasn't just about survival, this was about carrying someone who couldn't fight back, couldn't run, couldn't even stay conscious much longer. And as they moved deeper, the passage began to open slightly, the darkness thinning just enough to reveal a larger space ahead, a kind of natural chamber carved into the rock. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to think this might be a break, a chance to regroup, to breathe, but the dog's posture changed instantly, its body tensing again, not in fear, but in alertness, and it moved forward slowly, cautiously, scanning the space before stepping fully into it. And when the soldier followed, the sight that met him stopped him cold, because this wasn't just an empty space, this was something else entirely, something that didn't belong to nature, equipment partially buried in sand, crates stacked in corners, signs of movement, of presence, of purpose, and the air felt different here, heavier, like the silence was hiding something instead of simply existing, and his grip tightened again, because now it wasn't just about escape, it was about understanding what they had just walked into. And before he could fully process it, the dog moved again, faster this time, heading toward the far side of the chamber as if it had found something specific, something important, and the soldier followed, his instincts screaming that they had just stepped into something far more dangerous than the storm, far more complicated than a simple rescue. And as he reached the other side, stepping closer to where the dog had stopped, he saw it, markings, symbols etched into the crates, faint but clear enough to recognize, and his chest tightened instantly, because those markings didn't belong to any official operation, didn't belong to anything that should have been here. And for the first time since he had stepped into the storm, A different kind of realization settled in, colder, heavier. Because whatever had happened back at the wreckage, it wasn't an accident, and whatever they had just found here meant this wasn't over, not even close. The silence inside the chamber wasn't empty. It was watching, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat louder than anything else. And the soldier felt it immediately, that shift from survival to something far more dangerous, because surviving the desert was one thing, but stepping into something hidden, something organized, something intentional. That was a different kind of war entirely, and as he stood there, the weight of the man in his arms pulling at every muscle, his eyes moved slowly across the space, taking in every detail, the crate stacked too neatly to be abandoned, the equipment partially covered but not forgotten, the faint tracks in the sand that hadn't been erased by the storm because this place was shielded from it, and that meant whoever had been here could still be here, or worse, could be coming back. And the German shepherd moved carefully along the edge of the chamber, nose low, scanning, not frantically, but with purpose, its movements sharp, controlled, like it was piecing something together, and the soldier followed its gaze until he saw what had caught its attention, a trail, faint but visible. Drag marks in the sand leading toward a darker section of the chamber, where the rock dipped lower, forming a narrow opening, and his chest tightened again, because drag marks meant something had been moved, something heavy, something that didn't move on its own, and for a brief second, the thought crossed his mind that this could be a trap, that stepping deeper into this place could mean walking straight into something he couldn't fight his way out of, especially carrying a man who could barely hold onto life. But the dog didn't hesitate, didn't question. It moved toward that opening like it had already decided, like whatever was beyond it mattered more than the risk, and that was enough, because at this point, the soldier had stopped asking why, stopped trying to understand every step before taking it, because the truth was simple. If the dog had found him once, it could lead him again, and so he followed, adjusting his grip as he moved toward the darker section, each step heavier than the last, the air growing thicker, colder, and as he reached the opening, the smell hit him first, sharp, metallic, mixed with something else. Something that didn't belong to machines or sand, something organic, something that made his instincts flare instantly, and the dog froze for just a fraction of a second before stepping through. And when the soldier followed, lowering himself slightly to fit through the narrow space, what he saw on the other side made everything else fade for a moment, because this wasn't just storage, this wasn't just equipment. This was something hidden, something buried intentionally, more crates, more markings, but different this time, more precise, more controlled, and in the center of it all, partially covered, was something that looked like it didn't belong in a desert at all, a structure, small but deliberate, reinforced, protected, and that's when it clicked, not fully, not clearly, but enough to send a cold wave through him, because this wasn't random. This wasn't abandoned, this was active, or at least it had been recently, and the dragged marks led straight to it, disappearing beneath the edge of the structure like something had been pulled inside, and the dog moved closer, slower now, more cautious, its body tense, but not retreating, and the soldier felt it too, that pull, that dangerous curiosity that came with knowing you were standing at the edge of something bigger than you had expected. Something that connected the wreckage outside to whatever this place was hiding, and for a moment, everything narrowed down to a single decision: turn back, leave, take the man and get as far away from this place as possible, or step forward and risk uncovering something that could make their situation even worse. And under normal circumstances, the choice would have been obvious: survival over curiosity, escape over involvement. But the circumstances weren't normal, not anymore. Because the man in his arms wasn't just a survivor, he was part of whatever this was, part of the reason this place existed, and the dog, standing there, staring at that structure, wasn't acting randomly, it was reacting. Responding to something it recognized, something tied to him, And that meant walking away wasn't as simple as it should have been, and before he could fully decide, the man shifted again, a weak sound escaping his lips, barely audible but enough to break the moment, enough to remind him that time wasn't waiting for clarity, and as he looked down, he noticed something he hadn't before, something small, but impossible to ignore. A device strapped loosely against the man's vest, partially hidden under torn fabric, blinking faintly, and his chest tightened immediately because that wasn't standard, that wasn't something he wore unless it mattered, unless it was important enough to protect even in chaos, and suddenly, everything connected in a way that made the situation far more dangerous than he had realized, because if that device was what he thought it was, then this wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was something people would kill to recover, and the faint sounds from outside, the ones they had been trying to outrun, suddenly felt much closer, much more real, and the dog turned its head sharply toward the entrance they had come from, ears lifting, body shifting into a position that spoke louder than any warning, because whatever had been following them was no longer distant. The sound didn't rush toward them. It crept in, slow, controlled, deliberate, like something that didn't need speed because it already knew where they were, and that was worse than anything else, worse than gunfire, worse than explosions, because it meant this wasn't chaos anymore, this was intent, and the soldier felt it immediately, the shift from escape to confrontation, the moment where running stopped being the only option, and decisions became sharper, heavier, and far more dangerous, and the dog reacted first, not with panic, not with noise, but with precision, its body lowering, muscles tightening, eyes locked toward the narrow opening they had just passed through. Every inch of it focused on what was coming, and the soldier moved instinctively, setting the man down as carefully as he could behind a stack of crates, shielding him from view while keeping one hand close enough to feel the faint rise and fall of his chest, because even now, even with everything changing, that fragile life was still the center of it all, still the reason none of this could go wrong, and his other hand moved automatically, checking what little he had left, limited supplies, no backup, no clear exit, just a space that had gone from hidden refuge to potential trap in seconds, and the blinking device on the man's vest caught his eye again, that faint, steady pulse of light that suddenly felt like a beacon, something that could give them away just as easily as it could hold whatever information had made this entire situation spiral out of control, and for a split second, the thought crossed his mind to remove it, to disable it, to cut off whatever signal it might be sending, but something stopped him, not logic, not certainty, but instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive long enough to be standing here now, because if this device was the reason the man was still breathing, the reason someone might still be searching for him, then turning it off could mean cutting the last thread holding everything together, and before he could decide, the sound grew clearer, footsteps, controlled, measured, moving through the outer chamber with the kind of discipline that left no doubt. These weren't scavengers, these weren't random survivors, this was something organized, something trained, and the tension inside the chamber tightened to a point where even breathing felt like a risk, and the dog didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply held its position, eyes fixed, waiting, and in that stillness, there was something powerful, something that went beyond training, beyond instinct, something that felt like understanding, like it knew exactly what was at stake, and the soldier mirrored that stillness, positioning himself just off to the side of the opening, using the shadows to his advantage, every sense stretched to its limit, every detail amplified, the scrape of boots against stone, the faint shift of sand, the subtle change in air as something moved closer, and then a shadow crossed the entrance, just for a moment, just enough to confirm it. They were here, not searching blindly, not guessing, but following a path that led straight to them, and the soldier's mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation, angles, timing, options, each one carrying its own risk, each one tied to the same outcome if he chose wrong, and behind him, the man shifted again, weaker now, his breathing more uneven, more fragile, and that added another layer of urgency that pressed against his thoughts like weight, because whatever happened next had to be quick, had to be precise. There was no room for hesitation, and the dog shifted slightly, just enough to signal readiness, not to attack, not yet, but to move when the moment came. And then it happened. A voice, low, controlled, speaking in a language carried by authority, not shouting, not panicked, just calm enough to be dangerous, and even without understanding the words, the meaning was clear. They knew someone had been here, they knew something had changed, and they were close enough now that any mistake, any sound, any movement could give everything away. And the soldier felt the weight of that realization settle into something cold and sharp, because this wasn't just about getting out anymore. This was about making sure they didn't walk into something they couldn't survive. And as the shadow shifted again, moving closer to the opening, the dog's muscles tensed fully, its entire body aligning for action. And the soldier knew in that exact moment, whatever happened next, would decide everything. The moment stretched longer than it should have, seconds dragging into something heavier, thicker, as if time itself had slowed just to watch what would happen next. And the soldier didn't move, not even a breath out of place, because he knew this was the edge, the point where everything either held together or collapsed completely. And the shadow at the entrance shifted again, closer now, clearer, a shape breaking through the dim light of the outer chamber. And then it stopped, just short of stepping inside, as if whoever it belonged to was listening, measuring, waiting for something, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know. They weren't sure, not yet, which meant he still had a fraction of control left, a small window where action could still change the outcome, and the dog felt it too, its body coiled like tension ready to snap, eyes locked forward, waiting not for a command, but for the exact moment when waiting would no longer be enough. And behind him, the man's breathing faltered again, a weak, uneven pull of air that sounded far too loud in the silence, and the soldier's heart tightened because that sound alone could end everything. But somehow it didn't. The shadow outside remained still, just for a second longer, and then it moved, stepping away from the opening instead of through it, and for a brief moment, relief tried to surface, but it didn't last, because the sound that followed was worse. Not footsteps retreating, but repositioning. Spreading, controlled movement circling the space, and that meant they weren't leaving. They were surrounding, and the realization hit instantly, sharp and cold, because now it wasn't just about staying hidden, it was about being trapped. And the dog's posture changed again, not defensive this time, but decisive, its head turning slightly toward the deeper part of the chamber, toward the structure they had just discovered. And for a split second, the soldier hesitated, because moving deeper meant stepping further into the unknown, into something that could be even more dangerous than what was outside. But staying here meant waiting for something that was already closing in, and that wasn't survival, that was surrender. And the dog didn't wait for him to decide. It moved, quick, silent, slipping toward the structure with a confidence that didn't come from guesswork. And that was enough, because at this point, trust wasn't optional, it was the only thing he had left. And so he moved too, lifting the man again despite the strain, despite the growing weakness in his arms, pushing forward into the darker section of the chamber as the sounds outside grew more defined, more organized, voices low but urgent, equipment shifting, positions being taken, and every second that passed made it clearer. They were preparing, and the space around them seemed to close in tighter with every step, the air heavier, the shadows deeper, until they reached the edge of the structure, and up close, it felt even more wrong, too solid, too deliberate, something built, not carved, something placed here with intention. And the dog moved along its side, searching, scanning, until it stopped at a point where the surface didn't match the rest. A slight break in the pattern, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and without hesitation, it pressed forward, pawing at the edge, revealing a hidden panel that shifted slightly under pressure, and the soldier felt a surge of something unexpected. Not relief, not yet, but possibility, because this wasn't just a dead end, this was a way through, or at least something different, and with careful movement, he reached out, adjusting his hold on the man long enough to push against the panel. And it gave just enough to open a narrow space, dark and cold beyond it, and behind them, the voices grew louder, closer, no longer searching blindly but converging, and there was no more time left for doubt, no more room for second thoughts, because whatever was on the other side of that opening was now their only option, and as the dog slipped through first, disappearing into the darkness without hesitation, the soldier followed, carrying the man into the unknown just as the first beam of light cut across the chamber behind them, sharp and searching, missing them by seconds, and as the panel shifted back into place, sealing off the space they had just left, the realization settled in deeper than ever before. This wasn't escape anymore. This was something else entirely, something that had been hidden, buried beneath layers of silence and sand, and now they were inside it, with no idea where it led, and no way to turn back. The darkness on the other side wasn't empty. It had depth, layers, a presence that felt older than the storm, older than the war itself, and as the panel sealed behind them, cutting off the last trace of light, the soldier's world narrowed down to breath, movement, and the faint sound of the German shepherd ahead, its steps soft but steady, guiding him deeper into a space that felt less like a passage and more like something intentionally hidden, and for a moment, the only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat, heavy and controlled, forcing himself to stay focused, because panic in a place like this didn't just slow you down, it ended you, and the man in his arms shifted again, weaker now, his breathing more fragile, almost slipping away between each inhale, and that added a new weight to everything, because whatever this place was, however deep it went, it wasn't just a path anymore. It was a race against time, and the dog moved ahead without hesitation, its body adapting instantly to the darkness, navigating with a confidence that felt almost unnatural, as if it wasn't just reacting to the space but remembering it, and that thought stayed with him, quiet but persistent, because nothing about this situation made sense in a simple way anymore, not the wreckage, not the hidden chamber, not the people outside, and certainly not the way this dog seemed to understand everything. Before it happened, and as they moved forward, the air shifted slightly, cooler, more controlled, the kind of change that didn't belong to open desert or natural caves, and that realization tightened something inside him, because that meant structure, something engineered, something built with purpose, and as the darkness began to thin just enough for shapes to form, he saw it, walls that were too smooth to be natural, surfaces that carried faint lines of design, subtle but undeniable, and this wasn't just a hidden passage anymore. This was part of something larger, something buried deliberately beneath the chaos of the war zone above, and the dog slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but awareness, its head lifting, ears shifting, listening to something ahead, something beyond the immediate silence, and the soldier followed that instinct, lowering his movements, stepping quieter, more controlled. Because whatever was deeper in this place might not be empty, and the passage opened gradually into a wider corridor, dim light flickering faintly along the walls, not enough to fully illuminate the space, but enough to confirm what he was beginning to understand. This place wasn't abandoned, not completely, and that made everything more dangerous, because hidden places like this didn't stay hidden without a reason, and the man in his arms let out a faint sound again, barely audible, but enough to pull his focus back, enough to remind him that no matter how complex this situation became, the priority hadn't changed, survival still came first, and yet, as he stepped further into the corridor, he noticed something that shifted the balance again, small indicators along the walls, faint lights, subtle markings, systems that were still active, still running, and that meant someone had been here recently, or worse, someone still was, and the dog moved faster now, not running, but more urgent, as if it had found something specific, something it had been searching for this entire time, and the soldier followed, pushing through the growing tension, through the uncertainty, because at this point, turning back wasn't an option, not with the threat behind them, not with the man's condition worsening, and as they reached the end of the corridor, the space opened again into something larger, a room that felt controlled, contained, with equipment lining the walls, screens dark but not dead, and in the center, something that immediately drew his attention, not because of what it was, but because of how the dog reacted to it, stopping abruptly, standing still in a way that carried weight, meaning, and when he stepped closer, adjusting his hold to see clearly, he understood why, because this wasn't just another piece of equipment. This was something connected, something that tied everything together. And before he could fully process it, the faint sound of movement echoed from deeper within the structure, distant but unmistakable, and the realization hit harder than anything else so far. They hadn't escaped the danger outside. They had just stepped into a different kind of it, one that was waiting in silence, hidden beneath layers of steel and sand, and now it knew they were here. The sound didn't echo like before. It traveled differently here, controlled, contained, like it belonged to the structure itself, and that made it more dangerous, because it meant whoever, or whatever was deeper inside this place understood it, moved through it with ease, while he was still trying to read it one step at a time, and the soldier felt that imbalance immediately, the shift from survival instinct to something more calculated, because now this wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying ahead of something that might already be watching them, and the German Shepherd stood perfectly still in front of the central equipment, its body tense, but not panicked, eyes fixed on something that wasn't immediately visible, something beyond the surface, and the soldier followed that line of sight, scanning the structure more carefully, noticing details he had missed in the urgency of movement, subtle interfaces, faint indicators, systems that were still running quietly in the background, and in that moment, the blinking device on the man's vest pulsed again, slightly brighter this time, and everything connected in a way that sent a cold clarity through him, because this wasn't random, this wasn't just a hidden base, this was a controlled environment, something designed to receive, to track, to manage whatever that device represented, and the man he was carrying wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a key, and that realization changed the weight of everything instantly, because now it wasn't just about saving him, it was about understanding what saving him meant, and why others were willing to hunt him through a storm to get to him. And the dog moved again, slower now, stepping closer to the central console, its nose hovering just above the surface as if searching for something specific, and then it let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a warning, but something closer to recognition. And the soldier felt his focus sharpen instantly, stepping closer despite every instinct telling him to be cautious, because at this point, the dog wasn't reacting randomly, it was guiding him towards something important, and as he reached the console, adjusting the man's position just enough to free one hand, he saw it, an interface partially active, dim but functional, responding faintly to the proximity of the device on the man's vest, and his chest tightened, because this wasn't just a coincidence, this was interaction, this place was reacting to him, to the man he carried, and before he could pull back, the system flickered, screens lighting up just enough to display fragments of information, coordinates, data streams, incomplete but recognizable, and the realization hit harder than anything else so far. This wasn't just a hidden base. This was something tied to operations far beyond what he had expected, something controlled, monitored, something that wasn't supposed to be found, and the dog stepped back slightly, watching him now, not the console, not the room, but him, as if waiting for him to understand, as if this moment mattered more than everything that had come before it, and for a second, everything slowed again, the urgency, the danger, the noise, replaced by a single, clear thought, whatever this place was, whatever this device connected to, it was bigger than the storm, bigger than the wreckage, bigger than the people hunting them, and the man in his arms wasn't just surviving, he was carrying something that could change everything, and that meant the choice in front of him wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't just about escape, it was about what to do with that information, whether to use it, destroy it, or protect it. And before he could decide, the sound came again, closer this time, not distant anymore, not hidden, but approaching with purpose, controlled movement echoing through the structure, and the dog reacted instantly, turning toward the corridor they had entered from, body lowering into a defensive stance, ready for whatever came next, and the soldier felt it too, that shift back into immediate danger, because whatever had been deeper inside this place was now coming for them, and this time there would be no storm to hide behind, no sand to blur the lines, only space, silence. And whatever decisions he made in the next few seconds would determine whether any of them made it out alive. The moment the sound crossed into the corridor, everything became real in a way it hadn't been before. No more distance, no more guessing, just the undeniable presence of something moving toward them with purpose, and the soldier didn't wait, didn't hesitate, because hesitation now meant being found, and being found meant losing everything they had fought through to reach this point, and his eyes moved quickly across the room, taking in every detail with a clarity sharpened by pressure, the console still flickering faintly, the device on the man's vest pulsing in quiet response, the narrow exits, the angles, the shadows, and the dog standing ready, not panicked, not afraid, but prepared, its body positioned between him and the approaching threat like it had already decided what it would do if things went wrong, and that realization hit harder than anything else, because this wasn't just loyalty anymore. This was sacrifice waiting for the right moment, and he refused to let it come. To that, not again, not after everything that had already been lost, and the footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing with precision through the corridor, controlled, confident, and in that sound, there was no doubt left. Whoever was coming knew this place, knew its layout, and that meant they had the advantage unless he changed something, unless he disrupted the pattern before it closed in on them completely, and his gaze snapped back to the console, to the flickering data, to the connection between the device and whatever this structure represented, and in that instant, the decision formed, not from certainty, but from necessity. Because if this place was tracking, guiding, or controlling something beyond these walls, then leaving it intact meant leaving a path open for whoever was hunting them, and that wasn't a risk he could take, not with the man's life hanging by a thread, not with the dog standing there ready to fight something it shouldn't have to face alone, and with one controlled movement, he shifted his grip, securing the man against the structure just long enough to free both hands, and the dog reacted instantly, stepping closer to guard him, eyes locked on the corridor as the first shadow appeared at the far end, and without waiting for doubt to creep in, he acted, fingers moving across the console with the kind of instinct that came from years of understanding systems like this, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to disrupt, enough to break the connection that had been quietly running beneath everything, and the moment he did, the reaction was immediate. The lights flickered violently. The hum of the structure shifted into something unstable, something louder, harsher, and the footsteps in the corridor stopped, just for a fraction of a second, as if whatever was approaching had realized something had changed, and that pause was all he needed, because the dog moved without being told, darting toward the opposite side of the room where another narrow passage had been partially hidden behind equipment, and he followed instantly, lifting the man again despite the strain, despite the exhaustion pulling at his body, pushing forward with everything he had left as the structure behind them began to fail in controlled bursts of light and sound, systems shutting down, connections breaking, and as they slipped into the secondary passage, the first voice echoed into the room they had just left, sharp, urgent, no longer calm, no longer controlled, and that confirmed it. They had done something that mattered, something that disrupted whatever had been planned, and now they were being chased not just as survivors, but as a threat, and the passage ahead was tighter, darker, less stable, but it didn't matter, because forward was the only direction left, and the dog led without hesitation, its movements faster now, more urgent, driven by something deeper than instinct. Something that felt like purpose reaching its final form. And as they moved, the air began to shift again, warmer this time, carrying with it the faint trace of open space ahead, and that was the first real sign of hope, the first indication that this path led somewhere beyond the structure, somewhere outside the controlled danger they had just escaped, and the soldier pushed harder, ignoring the burn in his muscles, ignoring the weight, focusing only on the rhythm of movement, step after step, breath after breath, until finally, the darkness began to break, light cutting through the passage in thin, sharp lines that grew wider with every second, and then they were out, emerging into the desert once more, the storm now fading, the sky clearing just enough to reveal the horizon stretching endlessly ahead, and for a moment, everything stopped again, not in fear, not in tension, but in something quieter, something heavier, the kind of silence that comes after surviving something that should have ended you, and the dog slowed, turning back to look at him, not checking, not questioning, but simply present, and the soldier met the gaze, understanding passing between them without a single word, because everything that had happened, every decision, every risk, had led to this moment, and behind them, far beneath the sand and stone, something had been left unfinished, something disrupted, something that would have consequences beyond what either of them could fully understand yet, but for now, for this moment, it didn't matter, because the man in his arms was still breathing, still holding on. And that meant the decision the dog had made back on that ridge, in the middle of a storm where everything else had already been declared lost, had changed everything, and as the first distant sound of approaching rescue finally carried across the open desert, faint but real, the soldier took a slow breath, not as a release, not as an end, but as the beginning of something he hadn't expected to feel again, purpose, and beside him, the German shepherd stood quietly, no longer just a survivor of the war zone, but the reason someone had walked out of it alive.